What are the best tools to take camping? Well, I need a knife and a can opener and maybe a corkscrew. I really need a bottle opener, uh, maybe a couple of screwdrivers, and I could use a pair of pliers to grab things like a hot pot. But which would I choose if I could only take one? Well, a multi-tool will do all of those things, plus saw a branch, file a rough edge, clip your nails if you need it. The Swiss Army knew this and did something about it. Keep watching, and I'll tell you about penknives, jackknives, SAKs, EDCs, and how Paul Revere was the multi-tool of the Revolutionary War. I'm here in Essex, Massachusetts, in front of the First Congregational Church. I chose this location because they have in their belfry, still functioning, a bell that was cast by Paul Revere and brought here in 1797. The metal that went into the bell, giving it its unique tone, was both silver and gold coin and jewelry. The bell rings in C sharp. I've carried a pocket knife most of my adult life. Over the years, I've accumulated quite a collection. They essentially fall into three categories: just plain folding knives, knives with multiple functions, and pliers with multiple functions. So I've separated this video into three different types. Let's start with a folding knife, also known as a jackknife. I've never really differentiated one from another, but there is a subcategory known as penknives. These were typically used to make quills into writing pens. I've never actually needed to create a writing device from a bird's feather, but I think that it might work well to sharpen a pencil. That is, until I actually tried to sharpen a pencil with a penknife and discovered that a pencil sharpener actually does a better job. As a Cub Scout, I had a Cub Scout knife that I would slip into the pocket of my dark blue uniform with the yellow neckerchief for pack and den meetings. But in all the time as a Cub Scout, we never used it. Never talked about it. Never even acknowledged its existence. I think I brought it on a camping trip once, but I didn't use it there either. An early life lesson. People will sell you stuff that you don't really need. It was technically a multi-tool in the broad sense because it had a bottle opener, screwdriver combination, and all in the blade. I've long since misplaced that knife, but I do remember that my dad cautioned me to use it with care. I now have my dad's jackknife that he used for hunting, and this is an item that I cherish. But I don't use it either. So, what is a multi-tool? Well, basically, it's supposed to be a toolbox in your pocket. One tool that you can use to solve almost any problem. In a moment, I'll share if they actually meet that high bar. But first, allow me to share with you someone you probably have heard of, but you'd be surprised just to know how multifunctional this person actually was.
It's been said that the pen is mightier than the sword, but Paul Revere is known for calling men to arms, not for calling them to write. Revere was a man of action as described by New England poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Well, it's possible that Longfellow actually met the distinguished patriot. Young Henry would be a preteen, and the famous writer would have been around 80, and they lived more than 100 miles apart. He was, however, most likely familiar with the man from family lore, as Revere had served under Longfellow's maternal grandfather, Peleg Wadsworth, who died when Henry was 22. The poem does take some literary license as it goes on, but the first few lines, with which many people are familiar, are mostly true. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. What is a fallacy is that Revere rode alone. There were a number of other riders, including Dr. Samuel Prescott and William Dawes. Before I go on with their story, indulge me to inform you that Revere has already alerted Minutemen captains that early morning along the way to Lexington, including that of Isaac Hall of Medford. It's possibly here where Revere met another messenger, Martin Herrick of Reading, who then went to alert the towns of northern Middlesex and Essex counties as part of the alert and muster system set up for just such an event. This began the assemblage of men who had pledged to be ready to respond within a minute's notice of awareness of necessary action. William Dawes had taken a different route from Boston and met Revere at the house just outside Lexington Common, where John Hancock and Samuel Adams were hiding. They carried a message from Dr. Joseph Warren to the colony's two most wanted men that the regulars were coming to arrest them. That mission accomplished, Dawes and Revere set out to warn the town of Concord that the army was on their way to capture the military supplies stored there. While traveling west, they met with Dr. Sam Prescott, who was returning to his home in Concord. They hadn't gone 3 miles when they were detained by a patrol of redcoats. Prescott leaped a fence and got away. Dawes also managed an escape, but knew his horse would not be able to outrun the patrol. He tricked his pursuers by making them believe that he had lured them into an ambush, despite the house being empty, and they fled. Unfortunately, Dawes was thrown from his horse and was left to limp back to Boston on foot. Revere was held by the patrol until they heard gunfire from Lexington Common, whereupon they released him to respond to the action. So it was actually Dr. Prescott and not Revere that alerted Concord that the army was on the move. Revere returned to Lexington on foot to witness the latter part of the battle. While a man of action, Paul Revere did understand the power of words. He served as courier for both the Committee of Correspondence, whose role was to keep synchronicity through communication as to what the provincial governing bodies should do if the royal government was overthrown, and the Committee of Safety, the governing bodies to oversee those functions. Revere was active in both of Boston's committees as well as their action arm, the Sons of Liberty. He knew that words were tools that could grip people's hearts. Now let me get back to the tools that can grip people's stuff.
But first, if you find this video interesting, please take the time to pause and give it a thumbs up. Also, consider subscribing with the bell to be alerted to new videos I put out each week. If you have anything you'd like to share, put your thoughts in the comments. I'd like to hear them. Maybe consider sharing this video on your social media. It would really help. For now, allow me to return to Multitools with pliers. In the early 1980s, Tim Leatherman introduced a new tool to the world that married the functionality of a jackknife with the utility of a pair of pliers. Anyone who's ever been stuck on the side of the road wishing they had them will understand why this is practical. I've carried pliers in my car since I had to buy a set to repair a minor issue with my Jeep some 20 years ago. Sometimes your fingers just don't have enough grip for the job. I just bought this DeWalt. It has all of the expected tools, a soft grip, bright, easy to spot color, and was on sale. I intend to add it to my fishing gear. It'll replace my old Gerber multipliers. I liked this set because it could open with one hand. But The blunt pliers will work better when camping than removing fish hooks, so I'll relocate them. There's another manufacturer that offers a plier-style multi-tool that I'm certain is of extraordinary quality. However, their lowest price offering is $100 more than what I paid for the DeWalt. And that's the Swiss tool by Victorinox. They're the makers of the most recognized multi-tool jackknife in the world, the Swiss Army knife, or the SAK. Before we look at these diverse tools, I'm going to fill you in on the backstory of the SAK of America's founding.
Born in the north end of Boston at the tail end of 1734 to a French Huguenot immigrant, Apollos Revere, he was named after the Americanized version of his father's name. The senior Revere was a master gold and silversmith. Young Paul attended the local school, the North Writing School, until age 13. This school merged with the North Latin School in 1790 to become the Elliott School, which is still in operation to this day. He was next apprenticed to his father, where he learned to work gold and silver into functional objects. When his father passed away, Paul, now 19, was still too young to legally operate the business. English and French interests had been skirmishing in Europe since ever. But by 1754, the French had begun to arm the Native Americans and did not discourage their use against the British colonists. With conflicts escalating between the French and Great Britain in Europe, the British government could no longer ignore the events happening in America. By 1756, France and England were at war on both sides of the Atlantic. In February, Revere joined an artillery company and was stationed in New York as a second lieutenant. He remained in the Army until November, when he returned back to Boston, now old enough to run the business. The following August, 1757, he married Sarah Ornay and was well on his way to financial success when Parliament introduced the Sugar and Stamp Acts at the end of the war in 1763 to pay the bills. Suddenly, the prices of commodities began to rise, with artisans' income being reduced. The year following the end of the war saw Revere's family growing and his income cut by a third, along with the cost of living continuing to increase. Being a man of action, Revere started to get politically involved, and by 1765, he was an active member of the Sons of Liberty. I'll tell you about his activity with that group in a moment, but first, let me get back to a different army, that of Switzerland.
Though probably the most recognized multi-tool, the original Swiss Army knife was neither the first nor the most universally functional tool available. What it did do was answer Switzerland's need for a military tool that could open canned food, cut rope or cloth, and, most importantly, it contained a screwdriver that would allow the Army-issued rifle to be taken apart and put back together. In 1890, the contract was issued to a German company for 15,000 knives, as no Swiss manufacturer had the capability of producing that number. By 1908, however, two companies had grown sufficiently to allow the Swiss government to split the contract. They were Victorinox and Wenger. For over 100 years, the two companies provided the Swiss Army with knives, but also competed for market share throughout the world, both being Swiss Army knives. In 2005, however, the debate over which brand was better ended when Victorinox purchased Wenger. I actually happen to own a similar model of each. Although slightly different, they're functionally the same, except the Victorinox has a toothpick and tweezers. The Wenger has a nail file in place of a small knife. Personally, I prefer the Victorinox, but that's probably because I've owned it longer. They each have a cutting blade pair of scissors, bottle opener with a wire cutter, a screwdriver at the end, a can opener. The Victorinox has a small screwdriver as well, a corkscrew, and an awl. You'll need to decide if you need things like a saw, fish scaler, magnifying glass, file, package hook, and so forth. And if you're wondering if the Swiss still issue SAKs to the military, yes, they do. Now, let's get back to the Patriot equivalent of the Swiss Army.
After the war with France, as a craftsman, Paul Revere had joined the Freemasons in 1760. Within 5 years, the organization had become the core of ideas of revolution and formed the Sons of Liberty. By the late winter of 1770, tensions were running high in the city of Boston, and a group of rabble-rousing young apprentices taunted the occupying military into firing their weapons into a crowd in what has become known as the Boston Massacre. Revere, using his woodcut skills and his access to the Boston Gazette, created a sensationalized version of what had happened. He then went on to print a colored engraving. In May of 1773, 6 months after giving birth to their eighth child, Sarah Revere passed away. That daughter did not live to be a year old. Several months after his first wife died, Revere, now in his late 30s, met Rachel Walker, who was 10 years younger. By the middle of October, they were married. Rachel bore Paul another 8 children. In December of that same year, as the tax on tea had replaced the tax on stamps, Revere was part of the group disguised as Indians who had dumped the merchandise of the East India Tea Company into the harbor. After the British marched on Lexington and Concord, and the Battle of Bunker Hill in 75, Revere continued to operate as a courier. In 1776, he was tasked with producing gunpowder along the Neponset River in Canton, Massachusetts. Although he did not participate in the war for independence beyond New England, Paul Revere was involved in the Penobscot debacle of 1779, where General Peleg Wadsworth, Longfellow's grandfather, saw that Revere was court-martialed for dereliction of duty in abandoning his post. Revere was, however, exonerated of all charges. Clearing his name took several years, and Revere stepped away from the limelight until after the war had ended in 1783.
The phrase, never look a gift horse in the mouth, comes from St. Jerome's writings, and it means that it's rude to speak negatively of an object that is received for free. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be wary, however. Having worked in the field of IT, I would occasionally receive gadgets as giveaways. Here's one that I received one year during the holidays. As you can see, it's a multi-tool. I actually carried it for a little while. What I discovered is it didn't really do anything well. It would work okay in a pinch, but the tools were cheap and the blade didn't hold an edge. That's okay, I didn't expect that it would. My point is that when selecting a multi-tool, consider what you're going to use it for, and then buy the best quality you can afford. The value comes not only in what you have to pay, but how well it will work for what you need it to do. Also, don't buy more than you need. This is a quality multi-tool, and it has 33 functions. I was given this as a gift. It splits into 2 pieces. It sits in the drawer at our camp. Maybe it would be effective if your bicycle breaks down. I've never actually used it. Let me know in the comments if you have one of these and it saved the day. I'd really like to know. It's called the MacGyver, after the TV show. But in the program, the primary multifunction tool was a Swiss Army knife. And speaking of Swiss Army knives, let's finish up with Paul Revere.
As the new country was starting out, Revere was looking for a way to expand business. By 1792, he had built a foundry in the north end of Boston. Here, he began to experiment with casting bells. At first, he and his sons, Paul Jr. and Joseph Warren, tested different alloys, eventually striking on the ability to produce bells with pleasant tonal quality and durability. It was at this location that he also created window weights, firebacks, and cannons. There are a number of bells cast by Revere still in existence. One such bell is in the clock tower of the Old South Meeting House, where the Boston Tea Party was initiated. This was installed in 2011 from Westboro. Another bell can be seen in front of the old armory in downtown Salem, Mass. As a matter of fact, during the country's bicentennial, 134 Revere and Sons bells were identified. At least one is as far away as Singapore. In 1801, in response to the U.S. wanting to build naval ships, but not using English copper, Revere set up the first copper rolling factory in America at the Canton, Massachusetts site of the old gunpowder mill. The site is now a park, the rolling mill is a restaurant, and Revere's old barn is slated to become a museum. It was at this factory that the copper sheathing was manufactured for the hull of the USS Constitution, along with other copper and brass fittings that went on to the ship. This location is also where the copper plating was created that still sits atop the Massachusetts State House. And that copper works was also where the pots and pans bearing Revere's name started. In 1813, at the age of 83, Paul Revere passed from this life. He's buried among other noted patriots in the old granary burying ground near Boston Common. Every Sunday morning at 10:45, the bell he cast hanging above King's Chapel can be heard from his resting place. Let's listen for a moment to that sweet sound. While Paul Revere may have been a jack of all trades, he was truly a master of metal.
So, what's my takeaway? It's always good to have something on hand that will assist in performing the functions that require attention. I've seen multi-tools recently that do not include a blade. I understand that they target the flying public or people concerned about getting cut, but I use my knife almost every single day. What do I carry? When I was working as an IT director, I carried a Swiss Army knife that included a pen drive for software tools. I don't use that anymore. My everyday carry, or EDC, is just the Victorinox Classic SD with a blade, file, screwdriver tip, pair of scissors, toothpick, and pair of tweezers. So those are my tips on buying a multi-tool and selecting one for camp use. Spend some time thinking about which tools you really need. Pliers are great to have, but they add weight if you're carrying. Don't spend money on tools you'll probably never use. Spend it on tools that'll give you comfort. The best tool is the one you'll use. I hope you've enjoyed learning about multi-tools. what I own and which ones I use. Be sure to let me know in the comments if you have a tool you think I ought to consider, or if you've got a favorite. Tell me if you agree or disagree. If you got something out of this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more, check out my channel, Yankee Camper, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and get outside.